I'm not going to introduce all of them because time is energy, but I'm sure it will be a very nice dialogue. Thank you for being here today, and rise and shine, dears.
What I'm going to do is to say something about the contents of this book, which was published last year in English. Hopefully next year it will be published in French by Présence Africaine. I'm not sure of the exact date yet, but we hope sometime in 2020. So I hope to return for the launch of the French edition. Okay, so I start with a short definition, just to explain what it is that I'm discussing. I say in the book that Pan-Africanism is like a river with many different streams and currents. So depending on the time period, depending on the situation, depending on the particular problems which Pan-Africanism is addressing, it takes different forms. Even at the same time, it may take different forms. So it's not one, it is one river, but with many currents, streams. Okay, fine. It, in my view, is connected with the creation of the modern diaspora, particularly that diaspora which was created from the 15th century onwards, with the forced migration of some 15 million Africans, which you're familiar with. But it's also connected with the more modern diaspora, which we can say has been created largely as a result of colonialism, and which has brought those from the African continent to Europe as well as to other places. This diagram just shows some of that. I don't know whether you can see it here. This is migrants to Africa. This is migration within Africa between 1990 and 2017. This is migrants from Africa. And you will see that most of these migrants, or many of these migrants, are coming to Europe, also some to Western Asia. So Pan-Africanism is very much to do, not entirely, but it's very much connected with the creation of a modern diaspora. Now, one could say that Pan-Africanism has a very ancient history, but because I wanted to keep the book relatively short, I've only traced its history from around the 18th century. And because Britain is central to Pan-Africanism, as everybody knows, I've started my history in Britain. And with a famous figure, Alado Equiano, not particularly with him as an individual, but with the organization which he formed. And that organization was called the Sons of Africa. It was formed in the late 18th century. And I say it was one of the first Pan-African organizations. Of course, there are others in North America and so on, but just for the sake of presentation, this was an organization formed of Africans from many parts of the continent who found themselves in Britain as a result of human trafficking at that time. In order to address the common problems which they faced, they formed an organization. And they very clearly saw themselves as Africans, as the sons of Africa, united in order to solve the particular problem of human trafficking at that time. And of course, individually, people like Equiano and others also dealt or attempted to deal with one of the other problems which was connected with the whole human trafficking of that period, which was the emergence of a particular kind of anti-African racism. And so we find that in the first chapter of his book, Equiano presents a very different picture of Africa. We can say he's one of the first of the modern historians of Africa. He presents an Africa which is highly civilized, highly moral, highly legal, highly hygienic, and all these kinds of things. So his work and the work of the Sons of Africa is an early form of Pan-Africanism. The term Pan-African wasn't, or Pan-Africanism wasn't invented or coined, but it's an example of Africans joining together to deal with a problem which faced Africa and Africans in general. Another illustration would be, again in the same kind of period, the 1790s, would be the revolutionary upheavals in the French colony of Saint-Domingue, which became Haiti. And as you know, the Africans of Haiti rose up in 1791. They were Africans from different parts of the African continent, speaking different languages, with different traditions, yet they found a way to unite, to create a unified world view, and we can say revolutionary orientation. They defeated the three principal armies of Europe, the armies of Britain, of France, and of Spain, and they liberated themselves. They created the first modern African republic, although outside the African continent, and the first modern definition of human rights. They said that all citizens of Haiti were equal and black, irrespective of where those citizens came from. Whether they came from Africa or France or Poland, everybody was equal and black. So this is a very important aspect of Pan-Africanism. This is what we could call revolutionary Pan-Africanism. Not all Pan-Africanism is revolutionary, but this example we could see as a revolutionary solution to the problems that faced people at that time. Then if we go into the 19th century, there are many examples. Just to mention one or two people who were important, and of course, these people are situated in different places. One is this gentleman, Martin Delaney, who's known for many things, particularly for championing one aspect of Pan-Africanism, or one current, which is that those in the diaspora should return to the continent. So Martin Delaney was a champion of return, of repatriation. He also gave rise to the famous slogan, Africa for the Africans. He said, Africa for the Africans and black men to rule them. And as you may know, he returned to Africa and was involved in encouraging others to return to the continent. Then we have this gentleman, Edward Blyden. Edward Blyden was born in the Caribbean, but he returned to the African continent and was particularly active at the end of the 19th century in two places, Liberia and Sierra Leone in West Africa. He was many things, a professor, a journalist. He created one of the first Pan-African newspapers called Negro, which circulated throughout Africa, in the Caribbean, in the US, in Europe, and other places. He was also a writer. He was Liberia's ambassador and so on. And he's often called one of the fathers of Pan-Africanism. In fact, he had very contradictory ideas, which I won't go into now. But he is important in that he As I say, he was the first really to produce a newspaper designed for people both in the continent and in the diaspora. Okay, then we come to 1900 and the first ever Pan-African conference, the first time really that the word Pan-Africanism was used. I know that some people in the US claim that it was used there first, but people in the US always claim things like that, whereas those of us in Europe know much better. And particularly, again, it was held in the center of Pan-Africanism, Britain. Now, this is a newspaper representation of the first conference. It is normally credited to a gentleman called Henry Sylvester Williams, who was a Trinidadian lawyer. But in fact, as in many instances in history, the conference was inspired by a woman, an African woman called Alice Kinloch, who came from South Africa, and she inspired Henry Sylvester Williams and others to form an organization called the African Association in 1897, and to convene this first ever Pan-African conference. So again, it's important that women take their rightful place in this history, as in all history. There are many other things that could be said about it. One of the key participants was W.E.B. Du Bois, the famous African-American activist, professor, scholar. And he then took up the baton, we can say, of Pan-Africanism and organized four Pan-African congresses, the first of which was held in Paris in 1919. I should have mentioned that the idea of the London Conference and of all the major Pan-African congresses was for Africans to come together, to speak with one voice, to discuss the common problems that people in Africa and the diaspora faced, the problem of colonial rule, the problem of racism, and other related problems, and to find solutions to these problems. So Du Bois' first Congress was held in 1919. It was held just after the First World War, which, as you all know, was a war to redivide the world, and particularly to redivide Africa. And at the conclusion of the First World War, the winners of the war, if we can call them that, the victorious nations, particularly Britain, France, and the US, Britain and France principally, redivided Africa and confiscated the colonies of those who had lost the war, particularly Germany, and also, anyway, others as well, but particularly Germany. So Du Bois held this Congress to enable an African intervention, principally to say that the confiscated colonies from Germany should not be given to Britain and France, they should be given to Africans, and they should be administered by Africans. But of course the big colonial powers didn't take any notice of Du Bois, and the British and French took Togo, Cameroon, Tanganyika, Southwest Africa, and took them for themselves and so on. But that was the aim of this first Pan-African Congress. Then several other congresses were held. A second Congress was held, which was held in London and here in Brussels, as you probably know, featuring Paul Panda Fanana and the Union Congolaise. And then a third Congress was held in London and Lisbon in 1923, and a fourth Congress in New York in 1927. So these congresses kind of established the idea of Pan-Africanism, established a network of activists who were in touch with each other and who were demanding, or not so much demanding, but requesting that the colonial powers reform colonialism, that the colonial powers give Africans some rights, and other requests of this kind. They were largely, we could say, unsuccessful in those requests. They were also unsuccessful because they excluded the leading Pan-Africanists of that period, Marcus Garvey, the well-known Jamaican activist who formed his Universal Negro Improvement Association in 1916 and then re-established it, in 1914 and re-established it in New York in 1916, where it became the largest African organization of the 20th century, with members throughout the American continent, throughout the African continent, throughout Europe, and in many other places. And Garvey was famous for his slogans, Africa for the Africans, at home and abroad. But in regard to Africa, he had very similar ideas to Du Bois. Again, the idea that Germany's colonies should be taken away and administered by Africans, and of course led by him as president or so on. So his ideas were quite similar. But he also was very influential globally and was greatly feared by the colonial powers. His publication, Negro World, was banned in the British, French, Belgian, and other colonies. Okay, so there was another kind of Pan-Africanism that emerged in that period in the 1920s. And we could say it's associated with people like this gentleman. This is Lamine Senghor, who was a veteran of the First World War and originally from what is today Senegal. He was demobilized from the French army in Paris and joined the French Communist Party, and then became a leading member of the Comité de défense de la race nègre, which was formed in 1927. Here you can see its publication, Le Roi des Nègres, and you will see from what it says here that it's dedicated or aimed at Africans throughout the world. It's a Pan-African organization, but it's a Pan-African organization led by communists. It's also interesting that it uses the word nègre, which, as you know, is a rather strange word, but at the time they decided that this word they would reclaim it, rather like people in the 1960s reclaimed the word black. They said, we are reclaiming the word nègre, and we will use it in a particular way. And they actually said that those bourgeois Africans will not want to be associated with this word, so that will keep them away from us. Anyway, so it's a very important organization. It was followed by several other organizations. There was a Ligue de défense de la race nègre, and there were other organizations which were connected with the French Communist Party during this period. So we have the influence of, we can say, communism and Pan-Africanism combined. These two gentlemen, I'm only going to mention one of them. This gentleman is Otto Huiswoud, who was from Suriname and migrated to the US and became one of the founders of the communist movement in the US. And he was prominent in interesting the communist movement in the struggle of Africans globally. And in fact, this picture is taken at the 4th Congress of the Communist International in 1922. Through that, or out of that Congress, And through discussions amongst communists globally, particularly black communists, we find in 1928 the creation of this organization, the International Trade Union Committee of Negro Workers, which had its own program and which was concerned with African or black workers globally, whether in Africa or in the diaspora. So again, this is a very good example of a new kind of Pan-Africanism. Its main feature was that it was not interested in making requests, but it put forward demands. And it urged Africans to unite and to struggle, to fight for their liberation from colonial rule, and so on. And to fight in collaboration with oppressed people throughout the world. Then in 1930, these communists held their own kind of Pan-African conference in Hamburg. Again, we see the importance of the diaspora in Europe. Anyway, they held a congress in Hamburg to discuss their aims, and in fact, they based their activity in Hamburg and in some other cities in Europe, including actually here in Brussels. For a time, the headquarters of this organization, International Trade Union Committee of Negro Workers, were here. Not here in this building, but here in this city. So I don't know if anyone's looked at that history. But Otto Huiswald, who I mentioned a few pictures ago, he was based here until he was arrested and thrown out of the country. And if you're interested in this history, you can read my book. At the moment, it's only available in English and Spanish. This is the Cuban edition that's just come out. Maybe one day there'll be a French edition too, if anybody wants to translate it. Okay, so then, of course, we have, staying in the Francophone world for a moment, we have the whole development of what people call negritude, a kind of cultural Pan-Africanism, we can say, specifically to deal with problems created by colonialism, problems of assimilation, of cultural assimilation, and so on. And one of the key figures in the development of negritude was Jean Nadal, who you can see pictured here, who also gave rise to the phrase black internationalism, which our friends in the US like to use, when what they mean and what she meant was Pan-Africanism. So anyway, she coined that term in 1926, I think, and gave rise to this movement, which is more usually associated with people like Aimé Césaire, Léopold Senghor, Léon Damas, and others, whereas the women perhaps are hitherto have been excluded from their important role. And in fact, the Nadal sisters were very important in that they created the environment, literally, physically provided the environment for negritude to flourish and develop in the 1920s. So that's also very important. Do we want to have that? No, we don't want to have that one, I don't think. Then going forward into the 1930s, we find people like George Padmore, who was previously central to the communist approach to Pan-Africanism, parted company with the communist movement, moved to Britain, and was involved in several important organizations, along with people like Amy Ashwood Garvey, the first wife of Marcus Garvey, and others. And they particularly created organizations concerned with, have I got this? Yes. Concerned with the fascist invasion of Ethiopia in 1935, which was a kind of, I won't say a high point for Pan-Africanism, but an important moment for the anti-colonial struggle in Africa, in the Caribbean, and elsewhere, and united Africans in Africa, the Caribbean, the US, Europe together in a number of important organizations. And of course, there were major conferences that were held in Paris, and there were very strong links between those in Paris, in London, in New York, in parts of West Africa, in South Africa, and so on. And within that global movement of Africans opposing the Ethiopian war was Paulette Nadal. And Paulette Nadal, the sister of Jean Nadal, played a very central role in developing that opposition based in Paris in the late 1930s. This picture is taken from Wales, just to show how pan-European I am in my approach. It's a picture probably of communists in Wales in the 1930s. Okay, then moving on to the 1940s, we have the famous Manchester Pan-African Congress. Again, perhaps the most famous of all the Pan-African Congresses, held in Manchester, Britain. Originally intended to be held in Paris, but as I always tell my friends in Paris, the weather was much better in Manchester, so they moved. That's a British joke, sorry about that. It was, as you can see from perhaps the slogans, I don't know how easily you can see these on these screens, it's noted for, particularly for its politics. I can't see that screen. Freedom for all subject peoples, oppressed peoples of the world unite, Arabs and Jews unite against British imperialism, and my favorite, labor in the white skin cannot emancipate itself while labor in the black skin is enslaved, which is a quote from Karl Marx. So it's particularly noted for its politics and for its composition. Its composition was important in that it included several key future leaders, George Padmore, Kwame Nkrumah, Jomo Kenyatta, and several others. It was, of course, held at the end of the Second World War, which had been a war essentially fought against fascism, and a war which changed the world, and in which the peoples of the world had played a very prominent role. And as a consequence, were now demanding that colonial rule must end. And the Fifth Pan-African Congress in Manchester made that demand, that if colonial rule wasn't ended, they would use force to end it. They identified that it was the working people, the workers, the farmers, who would be the main force to bring colonial rule down through their political actions. They condemned the colonial borders of Africa. They condemned what they called the alien political institutions which had been imposed on Africa. And they condemned what they called the monopoly of capital, or what we today would call the capital-centered system. And they said all of these things must be brought to an end. So it's a very important landmark, and we can almost judge everything that's happened in Africa since by coming back to the demands of this Congress to see to what extent they have been realized since. Okay, then we have also in this period, the 1950s, continuing on the negritude route, the famous First International Conference of Negro Writers and Artists. In fact, there were two conferences, the first in Paris, the second in Rome. They're particularly important as a gathering of cultural workers, a Pan-African gathering, and for the kind of international debut of two important intellectuals, Cheikh Anta Diop, firstly, and secondly, Frantz Fanon. And they both spoke on slightly different themes, and in a way, these conferences showed that negritude was not exactly in crisis, but there were divisions within it as to its usefulness and its direction and so on. Anyway, in the book I go into more details, but just to give a general idea. Then we have, in this period, the idea that we can say Pan-Africanism returns to the African continent. That although there had been manifestations of Pan-Africanism before this period, we can say that Pan-Africanism was particularly something which manifested itself in the diaspora, in that the main conferences and congresses were held in Europe or North America. The principal actors tended to be in Europe or North America. In 1947, Kwame Nkrumah returned to the Gold Coast and led the independence struggle, we can say, and almost immediately began to develop a new, very Africa-centered Pan-Africanism. That perhaps began with the conference in Kumasi in 1953, which united various leaders in West Africa. Then, of course, Ghana's independence in 1957, and then two very important Pan-African conferences in 1958, the First Conference of Independent African States and the All-African Peoples Conference that were both held in Accra in that period, and which attempted to unite people, principally in Africa, to liberate the entire continent from colonial rule. And as you know, Nkrumah famously said that the independence of Ghana was meaningless unless linked to the total liberation of the African continent. And he set out to try and build that unity amongst African states and African peoples to achieve that liberation. One of his most notable presentations during that period was the book Africa Must Unite, which was published in 1963 on the eve of the founding of the Organization of African Unity. Of course, the OAU was a compromise between different visions for Africa. And Nkrumah was very much of the opinion that Africa must unite. There must be a United States of Africa, that only a United States of Africa would be able to stand against the challenge of neocolonialism. Only a United States of Africa would have the economic integration that would enable it to take its place in the world, and so on, and that for other reasons which he outlines in his book. However, other African leaders had different views. And so the Organization of African Unity was an important step forward, but a compromise. We can say its main achievement was uniting people to liberate the continent from settler colonialism, particularly in South Africa, in Zimbabwe, in Namibia, and so on. In other ways, it maybe created more problems than it solved. In this same period, we have a number of Pan-African organizations formed. I just mentioned one, the All-African Students' Union in Europe, which was founded by the Committee of African Organizations, which was an organization from Britain, but it established a student union throughout Europe, including here, I believe, and in France and in Austria and in many other countries. So it's a very important organization during this period. And anyway, there are many others, but it was inspired by, particularly by Nkrumah and by the anti-colonial struggle that was developing in Africa at that time. Of course, the developments in Africa during that period also had a major influence on those in the diaspora, particularly on people such as Malcolm X. And as you know, Malcolm X was inspired by events in Africa throughout his career, particularly at the end of his life, 1964, 1965, when he formed the Organization of Afro-American Unity, if you like, emulating the founding of the OAU, and with the aim of uniting people throughout the diaspora, and with a very definite program. And he said that Pan-Africanism, as you see, is also the key to the problems of those of African heritage. In other words, it wasn't just a continental phenomenon, but one that was important for the whole diaspora. His example, his politics, gave rise to or contributed to the emergence of a whole new current in the Pan-African river, that of what we now call black power. So without going into that in detail now, which I do in the book, anyway, it's an important moment. It had different qualities. One was the whole cultural renaissance and revival, the idea that black is beautiful, the wearing of the afro, which some of us are old enough to remember, or even to have worn, actually, in some cases. And on the other hand, it was important for the emergence of organizations like the Black Panther Party in the United States, which also had an international influence. I don't know about Belgian history, but certainly in Britain we had a Black Panther movement in Britain as well. Particularly important, the politics of that period, the idea of, again, of revolutionary struggle, of power to the people, of serving the people, these important principles, which perhaps some people have forgotten a little bit about today. This is a picture of Kathleen Cleaver and others. So as I mentioned, it gave rise to a whole cultural movement. This is one aspect of that, or one manifestation of that. It's actually a mural by an African-American artist called Nelson Stevens. The mural doesn't exist anymore, just the photo. But when I was writing the book, I saw it and I wrote to Nelson Stevens and said, can I use it for the book cover? He said, yes, please do. He said he didn't have it. Somebody else had it. He said, when we used to paint these murals, we just used acrylic paint. So when it rained, the mural disappeared. Anyway, you can see the mural says, work to unify the African people. So it was a good illustration of Pan-Africanism, concept of Pan-Africanism. Okay, then in this period, of course, black power, particularly the black theology movement, which emerged in the US, also had a major impact in Africa, particularly on people like Steve Biko and the black consciousness movement. And in the book, I go into the development of that and also its antecedents, the Africanist tradition within the African National Congress, the Pan-Africanist Congress, Robert Sobukwe, and others. So these are all streams and currents of Pan-Africanism. This period is also important in the 1960s for the development or the emergence of particular festivals. And one of the most famous festivals is the Algiers Festival that was held in 1969 in Algiers, Algeria. I say that because some people think Algeria is not part of Africa. So I just like to say that to remind people that it is still part of Africa and was then. Now, usually when I show this picture, I ask everybody to identify the two principal gentlemen who are standing up, just to see how much you know. So I've done that all around the world. So let's see how Brussels does with this question. Who are these two gentlemen? Two very famous gentlemen. Sorry? Very good. So the gentleman on the right is Amilcar Cabral. You've heard of him? Yes. And the gentleman on the left is? Nobody? Okay. The gentleman on the left is Eldridge Cleaver. You heard of him? Yes. Eldridge Cleaver, at that time, one of the leaders of the Black Panther Party, which had its own, headquarters in Algiers during that period. So here are the two of them meeting in Algiers. I don't know what they discussed. This picture was lent to me by Kathleen Cleaver, which I'm very grateful for. I just like to imagine what they discussed, what that discussion was about. So without going into saying more about Cleaver, I mean, Cabral is another important, we can say, Pan-Africanist figure in that his activity was not just related to one country, as you know, but to several countries, particularly those concerned with defeating Portuguese colonialism. And he maintained that principle when he was in Lisbon and also when he was in Africa, whether he was in Angola or Cape Verde or wherever he was, in fact. So he's an important figure also for his politics, and we may say more about that politics later if we have time, because his particular approach to solving Africa's problems, which we can say was a people-centered approach, was about the empowerment of people and how people solve problems for themselves, is extremely important. And probably I would say of all those personalities in Africa in the latter part of the 20th century, he maybe is the most important of all of them, politically speaking. Anyway, maybe we'll talk about him more later. Okay, well, other festivals, Festac in 1977 in Nigeria. Then, of course, there's a whole Brazilian Pan-Africanism, which I won't go into now, but is important, is in some ways influenced by negritude, has cultural as well as political dimensions. And of course, as you know, Brazil is that country which has the largest African population or African descended population outside of the African continent. So it's extremely important. And Abdias do Nascimento was one of the leading Pan-Africanists in Brazil. So in the book, I go into a little bit of detail. So then more modern manifestations, well, I'm not sure about the history in Belgium, but certainly in most places, 25th of May was celebrated as Africa Liberation Day. I think today it's been renamed, but when I was young anyway, it was Africa Liberation Day. We knew what it was for, what it was about, and so on. And in the 70s, it was particularly significant for highlighting the struggles that were going on in Africa, the liberation struggles in that period. Okay, so this is Queen Mother More, and I mention her to highlight the whole question of reparations. Reparations is perhaps one of the current aspects of Pan-Africanism. Obviously, it has a very old history, even going back to the 18th century and beyond, but the demand for repair as a result of human trafficking, colonialism, and so on is extremely important, and has been taken up both by the not only activists on the ground, but now by the governments of Africa, and more recently by the governments of the Caribbean countries of CARICOM as well. Then in the later 20th century, there were also other Pan-African congresses. This particular one, the 7th Congress in 1994 in Kampala. And in this picture, you see, second from the right, Tajuddin Abdul-Rahim, who was the General Secretary of the Pan-African Movement, was tragically killed. There have been other congresses since. In fact, there seem to be lots of congresses, everybody claiming that they're the, whatever the word is, the champions of Pan-Africanism. And maybe that's something we can also discuss. Then, of course, there's important to remember the role of women, and a whole women's movement developed in the 1960s with people like Aoa Keita and many others who formed women's organizations within the continent, and organizations like the Pan-African Women's Organization, which are kind of in existence. I think it's now part of the African Union. And there are other organizations which have emerged since. Then as we come to the end of the century, we have a kind of resurgence of the demand for a United States of Africa, led by Muammar Gaddafi, particularly, as well as from others. And that demand, in fact, Gaddafi, I recall, said that there needed to be a new African Union as a bulwark, as a barrier, as a defense against neoliberal globalization. But then when the African Union was formed, it wasn't. It was something a little bit different. But one of its qualities was that as its sixth region, it includes the entire African diaspora. So that is, in a shortened version, that is really what the book tries to cover and to present something of that history. I thought I would... No problem. Was it an important call? No? Okay. So I thought I'd just show this graphic, which is, I can't actually remember the source of this. It's a bank, I think. But you can see it's essentially GDP. And in a way it shows, it's misleading in some ways. In other ways it's not. It shows in a way, the amount of wealth that isn't in Africa, but it doesn't show Africa's potential, let's say. But what it shows to me is that the transformation of Africa is not just about economic integration. It's about something much more fundamental than that. So if we're thinking about the future, we need to be thinking about what kind of Africa, what kind of society, who are the decision makers in that society, and who are the decision makers that are going to transform Africa and transform the relationship between Africa and other parts of the world. So the question of African unity, African integration there's more to it, or more is required than that. Okay, that's all I had to say by way of introduction.
Yeah, thank you very much for the brief introduction to your book, and also showing us a few highlights that probably need a bit more research, even when reading the book, probably. I think it's been interesting because you've made quite a few links to Brussels as well throughout the presentation. And I think one of the reasons in the moment we are now in Belgian Black history, I would say, is the idea of what is there in Belgium, what has been here in Belgium, in the sense of what have Black people been doing here in Belgium for the past decades. I think what we are doing is, I'll let Aminata go into that. It's maybe not a point of view of like, oh, let's go back and just celebrate this glorious past, but it's mainly about what was then and what is now, and how do you connect both. And I think a book like this can be a sort of inspirational starting point, because as I said before, there is a lot of link between what was going on nationally, but also always the link internationally, and the role a very vibrant culture of connections, international level. I don't know, maybe I would like to ask Aminata to briefly for those who don't know Black History Month in Belgium, what is it that it's about, and how how that ties into the whole idea of unification, or like bringing people together of African descent.
Hello? Yeah. So I think, like, I remember in one of our first conversations when we were thinking about Black History Month, that it was very much about what kind of view we would have of what kind of history do we want to focus on, and the importance of focusing on a people's history and history from below. So to really look into those aspects that are a lot of times taken out of the official histories. And of course, when it comes to African people, history is something that is very important because of the denial of history that has been something ongoing, but also how we can look into the histories that have been written, but also just in the present moment, how do we want to go forth and go into the future, writing our histories so that they won't be lost. And so for us, that was one part, and I think the other part was, well, how we see. So it's Black History Month, and then the people of the Black diaspora here in Belgium, which I think a lot of times, of course, the first association is to the Congolese, more Central African descendants diaspora that you have in Belgium. But we wanted to really look into the diversity you do have when it comes to the Belgian Black diaspora, and see how all these different aspects that make someone's identity can be incorporated. So for us, those were just things that were very important, and I think through that we also keep learning about how connected everything is. And I do want to refer to, like, last year. Last year we worked around to the theme for Black History Month. Well, not last year.
Last edition.
We're already thinking about next year. So,
yeah.
But this year we worked around the theme Black Arts, Resistance, and Liberation. So we looked at how in the Black Arts movement in the US and the UK, and how arts, how it ties to more political, socio-economic struggles. And for that we had one international conference where we invited artists or people involved in the arts sector from the UK, from the Netherlands, from France, and from Germany. And unfortunately, because of budget reasons, we couldn't get anyone from further from the continent or from the US or other diasporas. But as a coincidence, then one of the partners we worked with, Museum of Photography, had an exhibition that was a collaboration between a British photographer who worked with an Aboriginal Australian community, and they just happened to come to Antwerp the 1st of March, so Black History Month is in March, and we were fortunate enough to have a conversation with them. So it was the British photographer and then one of the people leading the community, one of the leaders in the community, Jungarai Sims. And what was interesting is, I think for him it was a moment of seeing Black struggle going on outside of Australia. I think for him it was very much noticing how a lot of times I think the oldest African diaspora, the Aboriginal people in Australia, how interesting it is to see how much similarities and how much there is to learn. And I think that is going forward. We really want to see how we can keep the legacy of the Pan-African history and keep that going into the future.
As in, how do we not forget to keep on connecting ties to what's going on? Because speaking of the history we're making now in Belgium, I think the problem at the moment is like you have a very cultured way of looking at things and sometimes less politicizing. So everything can be brought back to culture and not in a sense how how politicized things have been historically. So that's also, I think, something that's interesting when you're speaking of now and when we think about, okay, what would people say about the generation we're living in now in 20, 30 years? That's something you would probably find as a stream, as you would then put, that's like a stream that's also ongoing next to the little flames that have been in Belgium, that are people that have established or tried to establish movements throughout here in Belgium that have pretty much died out after a few years. But I think going back to the book and your presentation, I think it's interesting. Have there been any, to your recollection, movements in the recent past between diaspora from Britain and continental Europe, as one might say, and how many insight can you give us on that?
Yeah, I mean, there are all kinds of movements. I mean, one very obvious one is reparations movement, which doesn't just include Europe, but North America, Africa, the Caribbean, and so on. And, you know, discussions exist between individuals and organizations in different places. There are, you know, Pan-African women's movement, which is certainly has its manifestation in Europe as well as elsewhere. There are a range of things. I think, to me, what is a key thing, perhaps I didn't emphasize it enough, about what Pan-Africanism is about, or has been about, is the question of problem solving. So if one looks throughout history, people have come together to address particular problems. And so it might be the problem of human trafficking, it's a problem of colonialism, it's a problem of racism or Eurocentrism and so on. So what is very, very important today is that there is discussion, there's analysis, there's as well as action on what are the problems, what are the key problems that need to be solved, and how should they be solved? What do we learn from history about how these problems should be solved? And as I said in the presentation, history shows us different approaches. Some are successful, some are unsuccessful, or some are more successful than others. So what lessons do we learn from that history about how we approach things today? I think that's always extremely important, that we learn the lessons of history so we don't repeat the mistakes of history. So anyway, without spelling out what I think, but I mean the book, and I'm always concerned about those issues, because it's not being a historian or writing things it has to have a purpose, a point to it. Otherwise, it's a waste of time. So to as I say, to learn from that history is extremely important, and then to having said that, then one then has to put it into practice today. We need to practice what we preach and take up these problems for solution. And particularly now, there are very, very big problems, whether it's facing the continent or facing those in the diaspora and so on. And of course, they're related problems. So I think how we approach those things, how we try and encourage others to unite to deal with those problems, that's extremely important.
I think in the works you've been publishing and your recent book, that's been like something very evident in your work, the purpose and trying to create or write something that will have an impact, not only by the knowledge you're collecting and then bringing out, but also the actions afterwards. And I think it's interesting to see when we talk about Pan-Africanism, or however we might rebrand it, depending who's talking about it. It's how much appeal does the word still have to a young diaspora generation. In my experience is that either it's a tainted word or it's something people unconsciously are maybe striving for, but they've never really stumbled upon Pan-Africanism, but they do strive for, like, oh yeah, we should be unified and tackling issues. So I was wondering maybe to use this moment to open the floor to the audience. Maybe we can start from that point to see what are ongoing issues here that we could direct to a Pan-African struggle, but also how the diaspora can play well, when we're talking action-based, what actions can the diaspora take from that? So with that, I would like to open the floor for the audience. I think we're gonna just raise your hands and I'll come with the mic to you. Oh, no. He's saying ladies first, but ladies are saying gentlemen first, so.
Okay, thank you, Professor, for your bright presentation on your book. I have one question. At which extent do you say that one organization is a Pan-Africanist organization? And how would you make a difference between different black organizations, saying this one is Pan-Africanist, this one isn't Pan-Africanist? Just a clue maybe could be, and you will give me your point of view, the fact that one organization will gather its members on a purpose, but with the consciousness of being Pan-Africanist. Is it something that I get right or not?
I think central to the concept of Pan-Africanism is the liberation of Africa and Africans. So if an organization is concerned with the liberation of Africa and Africans, then that it's a Pan-Africanist organization or it's a Pan-Africanist manifestation. It doesn't matter what it calls itself. Marcus Garvey never called himself a Pan-Africanist. The UNIA never called itself Pan-Africanist or whatever. I'm not even sure that Cabral ever called himself a Pan-Africanist. Maybe he did, I can't remember. That's not important. So what's important is just to describe this phenomenon, if you like, of Africans uniting, of recognizing that the struggles of Africans are interrelated or connected, that there are, in a sense, common problems and to an extent a common history and so on. But as I say, there are streams and currents, and one might say that some are more important than others. And the orientation that some individuals or some gatherings have taken, one can say that they have perhaps more significance than others. So if for example, we look at the 5 Pan-African Congresses from 1919 to 1945, they all have their significance, of course. They were dealing with slightly different problems, you could say. But generally speaking, history records, or history accepts, or history presents the view that the 5th Congress was perhaps the most significant of all of those congresses. So then, okay, so why was that the case? So one of its characteristics was that it was about the majority. It was about the masses of the people. And it centered the masses of the people as the main force which was going to transform things. So why is that important? Well, we can say it's important because it's true. It's not true because I say it's true. It's true because that's what history has demonstrated. And those who organized in 1945 reflected on their own experience. What had happened during the 1930s? They had seen the masses of the people in motion in Africa, in the Caribbean, elsewhere. They'd seen the power of that force. Just before the Congress was held, there was a national strike in Nigeria, Britain's largest colony. The whole country came to a standstill. So if the workers decide they're going to unite and do something, there's no force that can prevent them. And that is the force which produces everything. It produces all the wealth. So they drew that conclusion. So anyway, so that in itself was extremely important conclusion to draw. But then if we project into the future, okay, this conclusion was drawn. To what extent did those African leaders then and subsequently follow the logic of this conclusion? To some degree, some did, but to a large degree, they haven't. With what consequence? With the consequence that we still have the colonial borders, we still have the alien political institutions, we still have the capital-centered system. These are the things that they condemned in 1945. So, although we say that, I can say that was very significant. If it's significant, then we have to follow the logic and draw the appropriate conclusions, both the positive ones and the negative ones. And that gives us a way of looking at the world now. How is Africa going to transform itself? It's by the people transforming. It's not some leaders who are going to transform it. And then the question is, how can people empower themselves? So then we also look to history. How did people achieve that elsewhere in Africa, or maybe elsewhere in the world? And we can find some guide, not a model, because as we say, we are our own models, like we are our own liberators, but we can see, okay. So that's, to me, the importance of history and of this Pan-Africanism. As I say, some may be more important than others.
Okay. We have another question here.
My question is about ideology. Pan-Africanism for me is like an object. It's like philosophic thinking. This object, you have slavery and colonialism in this object. Do you think your book, Pan-African History, can give maybe a way thinking about this ideology? Which ideology must have this Pan-Africanism? The ideology I see about your history, you talk about communism. Do you think communism is a way? Me personally, I see in Atlantic side, like more American people try maybe to find a way about this ideology in Kemet, in Egyptian tradition. Do you think this ideology, this question about ideology, is not the essential thing, maybe to try to repair this object, where is slavery in communism is in?
Okay, I think the way I would answer it is that in order to solve the problems that confront us or confront the world, in a way we have to see the world as it is. So if I go back to my 1945, which is always my base, so 1945 they condemned the alien political institutions. Okay. So they drew on a whole experience. It wasn't a question of ideology necessarily, it was a question of experience. And being Africa-centered, that Africa should have its own institutions, its own political institutions. We could say that, well, let me say two things. One is that there's a necessity for those institutions to be people-centered. They must serve the interests of the majority of people. The alien political institutions, they don't serve those interests. They don't serve the interests of the people. They don't serve the interests of Africa generally. We can say they are Eurocentric institutions. Those of us who live in Europe, We live under those institutions. We know they don't work. They don't work in Europe. They were developed in Europe, but they don't work in Europe. If they don't work in Europe, how would they work in Africa? It's not possible. Okay. So we need to develop new institutions, or institutions based on the traditions of the people. Okay. Should we go back to Kemet to find these institutions? Okay. Then we need to think about two things. One is, what kind of society was Kemet? Was it a society where the people were at the center? No, it wasn't. It was a society where the king was at the center. So obviously when we talk about Kemet, we often fall into the trap of thinking of it as one thing. So we're talking about 3,000 years anyway, but even if we say it's one thing, it, generally speaking, was not centered around the people. Secondly, the institutions of Kemet were based on came out of the economics, we could say, the society of that time. We don't live in that period. We live in this period. So the institutions that we have must deal with the issues, the problems of society, the economies of today. They might take something from Kemet. They might take something from wherever, but they have to be suited to the needs of people today. So that's not really an ideological question. That's a question of, in a way, what is required? What is history requiring of us? So that's how I would look at it. If one continues to have institutions which have come from somewhere else and are linked to the capital-centered system, then you will keep having the problems which are associated with that system, which is that the people are powerless. The resources of these countries are continually plundered, both by those abroad and by the millionaires and billionaires on the continent. And the masses of the people are living on less than $2 a day, and so on. So, to me, these are not, I would say, not necessarily ideological questions. They are questions of problem solving on what is required. For many, many years, the solutions which have been presented for Africa's problems have been Eurocentric solutions, we can say, in one form or another. What do they say? They say, okay, well, if the rich get richer, then this is good for everybody. This is a lie. It's a lie. Even the IMF now says it's a lie, but it was always a lie. Even when the IMF said it was correct, it was a lie. It's never happened anywhere. The rich get richer, the poor get poorer. Because the rich only get rich because of what the poor are doing, what is being produced by people. So these institutions are incompatible with the advancement of the majority of people in Africa, just as they're against the advancement of the majority of people in Europe or in the US or wherever. So then you come onto, okay, what is required? So what is required is to have institutions where the people can empower themselves, where what is produced is, what happens to what is produced is decided by those who produce it. So if you're a wealth producer, you are the decision maker about what happens to that wealth. At the moment, we don't have that system in Africa or in Belgium or in Britain. That is why all these countries are in crisis. So I don't think that's a question of ideology. Of course there are ideologies, but to me that's a question of looking at how things present themselves and taking the appropriate solutions to deal with things as they present themselves today. Of course, the powers that be tell us other things because they have a vested interest in things remaining as they are. Whereas for us, our interest is for changing things. becoming the decision makers. So, we have to look at the world as it is. We draw on history, and then we act according to our interests, according to our needs. And you could say also according to the needs of society and the needs of the world, because also we face environmental crisis and so on. So if this capital-centered system continues, these political institutions continue, then the whole planet. Just to end with an anecdote, a few years ago I was in Cuba, and I heard Fidel make a speech. And he said the world is like a ship. And on this ship, there are a handful of people who are in first-class cabins. But the majority of people in this ship are below decks, as if in the days of transatlantic human trafficking. He said, unless those people who are below decks rise up and take over the helm of the ship, it will hit an iceberg and sink. So that's the problem of the world, and that's the solution. It's as simple as that.
Hello. I'll try to be clear. I think the youth coming from the Black diasporas are really appealed to Pan-Africanism because we really believe that it's needed to solve all of the issues that are encountering many African countries, but I also think that my point of view isn't like the closest. So I was wondering, what about the actual African youth itself? African youth. Maybe, do you know how is it positioned nowadays regarding Pan-Africanism?
Yeah, I mean, it would be impossible to give a general answer to deal with the whole continent. And I'm not even sure that that's the right way of looking at things, in a way. Because, as I keep emphasizing, in this river of Pan-Africanism, there are different streams and currents. So what is significant? What are the significant streams and currents? So one is what I've just spoken about, that the masses of the people, the majority, are key. And so in Africa there are, young people, youth, who have that orientation. That yes, we must be amongst the people, we must organize the people, and that's extremely important, that approach. At the same time, there are youth in the diaspora, including in Europe, in France, in Belgium, in Britain, who also unite together as people of African heritage or Caribbean heritage to deal with the problems that they face. And again, if one looks at the different aspects of Pan-Africanism, one of the key aspects of Pan-Africanism is internationalism. That because we say that Africans should unite, and that is it's in the interest of Africans to unite to address problems. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't also unite with other people who are not Africans. And of course in the diaspora that's extremely important because we're living in states where, generally speaking, people of African descent are a minority. So what action then do we take if we're in Brussels? How do we organize ourselves? Do we organize ourselves alongside other people who are fighting with similar aims and ambitions? So if one looks at the history of Pan-Africanism, you see that people have taken different approaches to these questions. And again, but going back to 1945, just giving that as an example, they were very clear that they're organizing as African and Caribbean people, but in unity with other struggling people. They might be British people, they might be people from India who were also struggling and so on. And their view was that, of course, everybody who is oppressed and has a common enemy should struggle in a united way to defeat that enemy. So that's also a very important principle. If we look at the example of the Black Panthers in the United States, they had a similar approach. That yes, they called for black power, but they also called for white power. They said power to the people, so that the people therefore should unite in order to achieve this power, to empower themselves. If we think of the other issue that we have in the diaspora very often is, in my experience, is people talk about, say you're in London and you talk about the liberation of Africa as if you are in Africa, but you're not in Africa, you're in London. So what is it you are doing in London to assist A, with the liberation of Africa, and B, with the liberation of yourself in London? Because if you change the situation in London, that would be very good for you and also very good for people in Africa. You know, if people of African heritage in Britain or in Belgium became the decision makers, just think what impact that would have on the African continent. So those of us who are in the diaspora, we have to be very clear about what we can do, what we need to do, what we should be part of, and all these kinds of questions. I think those are also very, very important. And we can learn also from history on these questions as well. So I hope that kind of addresses your question.
And on that note, I would like to thank you all for being here. I think Hakim, Aminata, and myself will be here. So I think if there are any other questions, you could maybe ask in private or further discuss. The book itself, you can get behind us. So thank you very much for being here. And once more, thank you, Hakim, for your presentation and your insights. Aminata for the insights about Black History Month, the organization here in Belgium. And yeah, see you guys very soon.